Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. And the family loved them. Everyone seemed blissfully happy. Rachel set up a website, Neil and Rachel, and she was constantly updating people on how perfect her life was and how beautiful her baby was and how handsome her husband was. They say you can choose your friends, but family is forever, or is it? Neil Entwistle had everything: a devoted wife, a baby daughter, and a serene home in Massachusetts, but in one terrifying instant that family bond was broken in ways no one could have imagined. What really happened to the perfect life he seemed to have? This case has captured the attention of true crime documentaries, popular YouTube videos, and even a gripping book, with jurors calling it a story of unimaginable and unforgivable family murders. And by the end of this video you'll understand why. On January 22, 2006, Neil Entwistle left his home around 9 in the morning to run some errands for his wife and their beautiful daughter, but when he returned, his world turned upside down. He discovered that both his wife and daughter had been shot dead, and he had no clue who could have done such a terrible thing. Neil claimed he was so heartbroken upon seeing the bodies that he considered taking his own life, but when it came to actually ending it all with a knife, he just couldn't go through with it. Instead, he hopped into the family car and drove over to his mother-in-law's house to get a .22 caliber revolver. Unfortunately, the house was locked up tight, so he told the police he decided to fly back home to England to see his parents. The news hit everyone hard. Friends and family described the Entwistles as a loving and friendly family with no known enemies, so the big question on everyone's mind was who could have killed them. There was no sign of a break-in, there was no sign of theft. Valuable items were laying around, and none of which were touched. To get a clearer picture, let's take a closer look at this couple, Neil Entwistle and Rachel Entwistle had been married for 3 years, but their journey together started long before that. They first met while Neil was studying at the University of York, where he was working hard to earn a master's degree in electronic engineering. Growing up in workshop, Neil lived with his parents Clifford and Yvonne and his younger brother Russell. Their family was solidly work and gas, with his dad toiling as a coal miner and his mom cooking in the school canteen. Now, life in workshop was pretty typical for a coal mining town, and while Neil and Russell had a normal childhood, Neil often felt a little embarrassed about their background. He dreamed of a fancier life, something that felt just out of reach. In fact, Neil had always been shy and often battled feelings of inadequacy, especially when it came to his Cockney accent at university. But everything changed when he met Rachel Souza, born on December 14, 1978 in Weymouth, Massachusetts. Rachel had her own story. She lost her father Paul when she was young, which shaped her into a strong and determined person. Interestingly, Neil and Rachel met at the same university because Rachel had applied for a study abroad program at the University of York, the same place where Neil was working hard to earn his master's degree. As Neil and Rachel got to know each other, they found a special connection that made them feel like they could take on the world. They fell in love with Neil, often declaring that Rachel was the person he wanted to spend his life with after graduating. Rachel is also determined to start a new chapter with Neil. They settled in Reddick, about 15 miles south of Birmingham, where Neil landed a job with a computer company. Rachel found her passion teaching English and theater at St. Augustine's Catholic School. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Going back, Rachel and Neil's wedding took place on August 10, 2003 at the Second Parish Church of Plymouth in Massachusetts, a beautiful day marking the beginning of their life together. Fast forward 2 years, and on April 9, 2005 they welcomed their daughter Lillian into the world. Everything seemed perfect, and those who knew Neil and Rachel personally often described them as a cute, loving family. Rachel thrived at St. Augustine's, where she formed close bonds with her fellow teachers and students. Outside of work, she built a solid circle of friends and a vibrant community, always bringing warmth and laughter to those around her. But for Neil, things weren't as rosy. He struggled to find his footing in this new life, weighed down by insecurities about his working class roots and his thick workshop accent. He felt like an outsider. No matter where he went, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that everyone was judging him for how he spoke and where he came from. This internal battle held him back from pursuing better opportunities in England, leaving him feeling trapped in a life that didn't fully reflect who he wanted to be. Feeling insecure and ready for a change, Neil was on the lookout for a fresh start, maybe even a chance to find his true calling. So he suggested that they pack up and move to Rachel's home state of Massachusetts. And while Rachel loved her job and had made some great friends in Reddick, the idea of being closer to her mom and stepdad Priscilla and Joe excited her. With little Lillian in the mix, she couldn't wait for her parents to play a bigger role as grandparents. When it came time to move, Neil told his job he had some personal stuff to figure out and that heading to the States was the best way to keep Rachel happy. But here's the catch: he didn't tell anyone, not even Rachel, that he had actually quit his job. Instead, he let her and her family think he was still working remotely for the computer company. And after making the big move back to Massachusetts, Neil and Rachel started spending more time with her family. One day at a family gathering, Neil went shooting with Rachel's stepdad Joe and her brothers. Joe pulled out the lockbox where he kept his guns, and while Joe and the brothers picked theirs out, Neil, being inexperienced, opted for the smallest gun, a .22 caliber revolver. It was his first time shooting a gun since moving. Although Neil and Rachel were living with her parents, they were eager to find their own place. They set their sights on a house in Hopkin, a town famous for being the starting point of the Boston Marathon. The house, located at 6 Cubs Path, was in a quiet cul-de-sac and had 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, and a spacious 400 square foot. Perfect for their little family. As mentioned, Neil wasn't bringing in any money, so how are they going to afford this dream home? Well, Neil managed to convince the owner to let them rent it on a short-term 3-month lease for $2,700 plus an upfront payment of $5,400 for the first and last month's rent. He told the owner he was just waiting for his offshore accounts to transfer to the US so they could buy the house. Around this time, Rachel tried to use one of Neil's credit cards, only to find it was frozen. After that incident, she confronted Neil about their finances, but he refused to answer her questions. By this point, Neil had piled up about $40,000 in credit card debt. Obsessed with living an upper-class lifestyle, Neil wanted to shake off the humble beginnings he grew up with and be seen as part of the elite. This desire pushed him to come up with some pretty questionable ways to make money. He spent a lot of time creating scam websites that promised people they could get rich quick with pyramid schemes. One of these sites, called millionmaker.co.uk, claimed participants could earn $6,000 a month within the first 6 months of signing up, charging a $90 setup fee and $25 a month for support for people running online adult businesses. Neil's second venture was a company called Embedded New Technologies Limited. The website had no products or services listed but had Neil as the main contact. Then there was Senior Publications, which promised earnings of $20,000 a month by spending only a couple of hours a week online. The ad didn't specify what was being sold but charged $60 to join. He also created a porn site that featured barely legal women and even had a site advertising penis enlargement methods. On top of that, he seemed to have an online gambling issue. Court records later showed that in the month before Rachel and Lillian's deaths. He lost hundreds of dollars on a gambling site called Casino One, which was run by a company based in Gibraltar. To make matters worse, Neil was selling CDRMs of his get-rich schemes on eBay, calling them business manuals, but around 2006 he started taking people's money without delivering the CDs. This got him in hot water with eBay, which ended up shutting down his account and launching an investigation. While Neil was busy scamming people online, Rachel was focused on settling into their new home. She was unpacking boxes and getting everything organized for a visit from her old college friends. Rachel wanted everything to be perfect for her friend's visit, so she was working hard to get the house in order. Between unpacking and taking care of Lillian, she was totally wiped out. By the end of the day, after putting Lillian to bed, Rachel would head off to sleep, leaving Neil with plenty of time to himself. During that same week, Neil's Google search history was very alarming. He looked up things like quick suicide methods, best way to kill someone, and knife and neck kill. He even found an online forum where someone suggested it was better to stab someone just below the rib cage instead of going for the aorta. And he didn't stop there. Neil was also busy online searching for escort services. On January 16, he checked out Adult Friend Finder and another site called halfpricesescorts.com. Just 2 days later, he was looking for escorts in Westboro. Then on January 18, he logged back into both Adult Friend Finder and halfpricesescorts.com again. He even downloaded a map for blonde beauty escort services in Worcester, which is about half an hour from Hopkins. But that wasn't all. Neil also searched for flights to the UK on sites like flymanchester.com, lastminute.com, British Airways and Manchester Airport. It was pretty clear he had a lot going on in his mind. On January 20, 2006, Neil left the house that morning telling Rachel he was going to the mall to pick up some computer stuff, but that was a total lie. Instead, he went to his in-laws' house, which was empty at the time. Using a spare key, he let himself in and headed straight for the box where Joe kept his guns. He took out the .22 revolver, the same one he had shot for the first time not long ago. After grabbing the gun, he returned home, where Rachel was upstairs in their bedroom with Lillian. Although it's never been confirmed what exactly happened, authorities believe Rachel and Lillian were in the primary bedroom when Neil came in with the revolver. At this point, it was clear that the person behind the shocking murder wasn't just a stranger, he was someone who had been part of their lives for years. Reports say that Rachel was holding little Lillian when Neil turned the gun on them. Rachel took a bullet to the head and Lillian was shot in the abdomen, with the bullet also hitting Rachel right under her breast. That evening, Rachel's friends, who she had been so excited to see, showed up at the house. When no one answered the door, worry set in. They called Rachel's phone, and to their dismay they could hear it ringing inside the house. Then they spotted a note from Priscilla, Rachel's mom, which only made them more anxious. Feeling something was really wrong, they called Priscilla and rushed to the Hopkins police station to report Rachel missing. A couple of patrol officers at the station decided to check on the aunt whistles. When they arrived at the house, they noticed that all the windows and doors were locked. One of the officers cleverly used a card from his wallet to unlock the front door. Inside, they found the TV still on and the family dog Sally, a basset hound, barking from her crate. At first, the officers worried that the family might have been affected by a carbon monoxide leak, but seeing Sally alive put that thought to rest. As they made their way upstairs, the officers heard classical music coming from what they guessed was Lillian's room. They also noticed a bathtub full of cold water, suggesting someone had been getting ready for a bath in the master bedroom. The bed looked like it had been slept in, with sheets and comforters tossed carelessly. Still, no one was home. Noticing that the family car was missing from the garage, the officers ran the license plate to check if it had been involved in any accidents that day. They didn't find anything suspicious. The authorities figured that maybe the aunt Whistles had to rush out for some emergency since the plates were still on the table and there was no blood or anything strange around, but the friend who was worried about Rachel refused to leave without getting some answers even though it was freezing outside. She and her sister, who was also Rachel's friend, decided to park their car right in front of the Entwistle house and spend the night there. They had been warned not to go inside to avoid messing with any potential evidence. The next day the patrol officers returned for another search of the house. This time as they walked in, they were hit by a terrible smell. Following the stench upstairs, they made their way to the master bedroom, where the odor grew stronger. One officer decided to lift the covers on the bed, a crucial step they hadn't taken the day before. To their horror, he discovered a woman's foot. Pulling back the covers fully revealed the lifeless bodies of Rachel and Lillian. The officers quickly called for backup and the medical examiner turning the Entwistle home into a crime scene. Meanwhile, the family's white BMW was located at the airport with the keys still in the ignition. That same day, Rachel's parents received a call from Neil's father, Clifford. He shared that Neil had called him the day before, claiming he found Rachel and Lillian dead when he returned home from the mall in a state of panic. Neil said he called the police and then drove to their house, but neither Priscilla nor Joe was home at the time. Clifford expressed his concern, saying Neil was distraught and had decided to catch a flight back, but the bizarre events didn't stop there. After hanging up with Clifford, Rachel's parents received a call from Neil himself. He told Joe a story similar to Cliff's, but conveniently left out mentioning that he called the police, likely because Joe would know that no one had done that the day before. On the 23rd of January 2006, Neil received a call from Massachusetts State Police Sergeant Robert Manning. It was bold of Manning to reach out to Neil, and even bolder for Neil to stay on the line for nearly 2 hours. When Manning delivered the devastating news that his family was dead, Neil simply replied, "I know," leaving Manning in stunned silence. My goal for the whole conversation was to obtain as much information as I could. Throughout the conversation, Neil recounted a version of events that mirrored what he and Clifford had told Joe, insisting that no one would have known Rachel and Lillian were home alone. Manning probed Neil's actions, questioning why he hadn't contacted the police or reached out to Priscilla or Joe. After discovering the bodies, Neil explained that he didn't have their work numbers and had gotten lost trying to find Priscilla. Then, in a troubling revelation, he shared that after finding Rachel and Lillian, he had wanted to end his own life. Manning pressed him for details, asking why he felt that way. Neil replied that he simply wanted to be with his wife and daughter. He mentioned planning to retrieve a .22 pistol to take his life, but authorities suspected he actually intended to return the gun he had used to kill them. Knowing that Rachel's parents would be at work in another call with Manning, Neil explained he left the keys in the ignition of his BMW at the airport because he didn't think he would need them. When Manning asked if he planned to return to the US, Neil reportedly replied, "I don't know, why would I do that?" He also contacted the landlord of his rental house, saying he no longer had interest in it and requested his security deposit back, talking about Rachel and Lillian's belongings as if it were business as usual. A couple of weeks later, services were held for Rachel and Lillian, but Neil did not return for them. One day, authorities got a tip that Neil had left a friend's house in Scotland and was on a train. Fearing he was trying to go into hiding, they stopped the train and arrested him. During the arrest, they found a news clipping about escort services, and it was later revealed that Neil had been browsing escort sites in the days following Rachel and Lillian's deaths. Back in the US, a judge issued an arrest warrant for Neil. When he waived his rights to extradition, he was quickly brought back. Soon after his return, Neil began changing his story. He claimed that when he found Rachel and Lillian, he immediately thought it was a murder suicide. He said he found Joe's .22 revolver near the bodies and believed Rachel had killed Lillian before taking her own life. This time, he said he returned the revolver to the Mosso house and put it back in the lockbox. Neil claimed he didn't call the police because he wanted to protect Rachel's honor, not wanting anyone to know she had killed Lillian and herself. This twist in his story was not only a blatant lie but also deeply insulting to Rachel. Her family was horrified at the suggestion that Rachel could do something so horrific. They couldn't believe Neil would stoop so low, especially when his story was not just a self-preserving lie. It was also physically impossible. Authorities confirmed that Rachel had been holding Lillian when they were shot, and the length of the gun made it impossible for her to have shot them both. As the trial approached, Neil's defense team made two significant requests to the judge. First, they sought Neil's release on bail, arguing that he should return to the United Kingdom to live with his parents until the trial commenced. They also requested that all evidence collected from the Entwistle home be excluded, claiming officers had entered without a search warrant. Both requests were ultimately denied. The judge ruled that officers were legally allowed to enter the home, given the circumstances, and since the investigation technically began when Rachel and Lillian were found, all evidence collected was admissible during the trial. And when it's time for the trial to take place, Neil's defense did not call any witnesses and he did not testify on his own behalf. They attempted to argue that Rachel had used the gun since her DNA was found on it. However, it was important to note that the DNA was only detected around the inside of the barrel. No DNA from Rachel was found on the gun's grip. That distinction belongs solely to Joe, his sons, and Neil. While Neil's DNA could have been left when he previously handled the gun with Joe and his sons, the critical fact remained: Rachel's DNA was absent, serving as proof that she had not used the gun herself. Eventually, Neil was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 2 life sentences, without the possibility of parole. When he heard the verdict, he broke down but quickly put on a stone-faced expression. Guilty of murder in the first degree of Lillian Entwistle. After a day and a half of deliberations, a jury found Neil Entwistle guilty of murdering his wife and infant daughter. After the sentencing, Neil's parents, Cliff and Yvonne, who still maintain their son's innocence, expressed their devastation to the press. They reiterated their belief that Rachel had killed Lillian and then taken her own life. They said, "We know that our son Neil is innocent and we are devastated to learn that the evidence points to Rachel murdering our grandchild and then committing suicide. I knew Rachel was depressed. Our son will now go to jail for loving, honoring and protecting his wife's memory." When a reporter asked Cliff and Yvonne if they had ever tried to help Rachel, considering they knew about her struggles, they opted not to answer. In a similar vein, Rachel's family shared their own heartache, stating that the verdict didn't erase the pain they were enduring. In August 2008, Neil Entwistle was tricked into shaving his head, thinking it would earn him the protection of a white supremacist prison gang. Instead of safety, he was met with chilling words: "It's a nice gesture on your part, but we're going to kill you." As a result, Neil was placed in protective custody, also known as administrative segregation or ADSG. By December, he was transferred to the Old Colony Correctional Center, a medium security prison in Bridgewater. Fast forward to 2016, Neil's parents still insisted their son was innocent. They argued that Neil was only guilty of wanting to protect Rachel's memory. While in prison, Neil made some pen pals and shared a new version of what happened that day. He claimed he never left the house. He was in the kitchen when he suddenly heard gunshots from upstairs. He ran up to find Rachel had shot Lillian and then saw Rachel take her own life. In 2023, Neil claimed that a juror who was the same height as Rachel, standing at 5 feet 2 inches, violated his rights by reenacting the murder in the jury room. He argued that this reenactment wasn't following proper rules of evidence and he has been pushing for a new trial, but his request was denied. Once again, it was clear that Neil was a deeply troubled individual, fixated on how others perceived him. Story 2. They say blood is thicker than water, but for Lydia, she never had the chance to prove the saying wrong. In a twist of fate, her own family was brutally murdered by her own brother. The story goes that it was done coldly and without mercy, but this is still all alleged. The Thompson family has been missing for nearly 30 years now, and the reason behind their disappearance remains a complete mystery. What makes it even stranger is that this case barely made headlines, and there's been almost no coverage over the years. The surviving relatives are left in a haunting silence, with no answers and little hope that they'll ever find any. But we're not letting this case go cold. We're about to dissect every clue, every suspect, and every twisted motive in a hunt to uncover what truly happened to the Thompsons, starting with the person who everyone believed had a hand in the tragedy, Lydia's brother Kenneth White. He was the only suspect in this case, but despite all the theories and suspicions, there was no hard evidence linking him to the crime. With no proof, he was never charged. But before we get into the details of his involvement, let's take a step back and really get to know the family now. Lydia White was married to Everett Thompson in 1996. Everett was 40 years old while Lydia was 43. Together they had two young sons, Everett Jr., who was 11, and Andrew, who was 8. The Thompson family lived in the Chatham neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. It was a close-knit working-class area where everyone seemed to know each other. Everett and Lydia had been married for quite some time. They got married in 1982 after Everett moved to Chicago to work at one of the nearby steel mills. Originally from Philadelphia, Everett kept in touch with his parents back home even after settling in Chicago. As you can see, he was a family man through and through. In a bold move, Everett and Lydia decided to open their own restaurant, Eaton Company, which was named after Everett's initials. Eat. Everett was the head cook, and cooking wasn't just a job for him, it was his passion. He loved being in the kitchen, experimenting with new dishes and bringing people together through food. Lydia, on the other hand, inherited the family home in Chatham after her parents passed away. She owned a third of the property, sharing it with her two siblings, Kenneth and Phyllis. This home full of memories had been in the family for years, and everything seemed to be falling into place for the Thompsons. They were a hard-working family, chasing their dreams together. But then in February of 1996, just a few months before the Thompson family disappeared, Lydia's brother Kenneth was released from prison. He had served time for a range of crimes, including sexual assault and kidnapping. After his release, he decided to move in with Lydia and her family at the house their parents had left to them. Remember, the house was shared between Lydia, her siblings Phyllis, and Kenneth, so things quickly got tense. Kenneth felt like the house was his by right and was upset that he had to share it with Lydia and her family. Meanwhile, Everett's side of the family saw Kenneth as a freeloading guest who was overstaying his welcome. The tension was thick and soon constant arguments started breaking out. The arguments were so intense that things started to spiral out of control. It got so bad that Kenneth allegedly chased Lydia around the house with an axe, and it wasn't just empty threats. In fact, on July 3, 1996, Lydia was desperate enough to call the police. She told them that her brother was after her with an axe, threatening her life. It was a scary situation, and you can imagine how terrifying it must have been for Lydia. However, when the police arrived, they found the situation had calmed down. According to the police, it wasn't as chaotic as it had been when Lydia made the call. Despite the severity of the threat, no arrests were made. The police did a quick sweep of the house, but everything seemed in order. Nothing was broken, no visible signs of damage, and no immediate danger seemed present, so they left thinking it was just a family dispute that would blow over. Now, if you were thinking clearly, this would have been a huge red flag, even without considering Kenneth's past, which included serious crimes that had landed him in prison before. This was a major warning sign, but since Kenneth was Lydia's brother, she probably didn't want to believe that he could truly be a threat. She probably thought, he's family, he wouldn't really hurt me. But little did she know Kenneth's mind was much more twisted than she realized. Just 2 days later, on July 5, 1996, things took another turn for the worse. Everett was at work running his restaurant, Eaton Company. He was chatting on the phone with his father Herman Thompson, who was asking when the family would be taking a vacation to visit him. Herman, who lived in Philadelphia, was eager to see his grandkids and wanted to know when Everett would bring the family out. Everett promised his dad that they'd visit as soon as he could take some time off work. It was a normal conversation, filled with the usual family chatter, but then right in the middle of that phone call, Everett got another call, this time from Lydia. When he picked up, he could immediately tell something was wrong. Lydia was frantic, her voice shaking as she explained what was happening at home, and according to her, Kenneth was at it again. He was chasing her around with an axe just like before. What's even more terrifying is that she was at home alone with the two boys. According to Herman, as soon as he hears what's happening, Everett immediately jumps back on the phone and says, "I got to go home right away, Dad. Lydia's brother is chasing her around the house with an axe. She's locked herself in the bedroom and called me to come home. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot." Going back to the story, Everett hangs up with his dad and tells the restaurant manager that he has to leave to go home. Employees at the restaurant see Everett rush out, jumping into the family van, and that's the last time anyone sees or hears from him. But here's where things get really strange. About 2 hours after Everett leaves, Kenneth shows up at the restaurant driving the family van. He walks in and tells the manager that Everett had been arrested after a car accident. The manager notices something odd though. Kenneth is wearing white shoes and there's something strange on them, like stains. It's a detail that will haunt the case later. Over the next several days, Herman repeatedly tries to get in touch with his son. He calls the family home, he calls the restaurant, but nobody has heard from Everett, Lydia, or the kids. It's like they've just vanished into thin air. Herman grows increasingly worried and frustrated, but no one can tell him where his son or the rest of the family is. Finally, on July 17, 1996, 12 days after that frantic phone call with Everett, Herman calls the Chicago police, and when the police arrived at the Thompson family home, the only person they found was Kenneth. He was the one to tell them that the family had gone on vacation either to Pennsylvania or Minnesota. According to Kenneth, they drove the family van there, which coincidentally was also missing. At first the police didn't question his story too much. They took him at his word and left, assuming everything was fine. But things didn't stay fine for long. As the days went on, Kenneth's story kept changing. He first told people that the family had driven to Philadelphia, then he switched it up and said they had caught a bus to Minnesota. Later he even told some folks that the family had flown to Hawaii. The inconsistencies were piling up and it was becoming harder to ignore that something wasn't right. Now here's the part that really raises eyebrows. The police never seemed to make the connection, or at least they didn't act on it. As you can remember, just a few days before all this, Lydia had called the cops in a panic, claiming that Kenneth had chased her around the house with an axe. Now just a few days later, the family is missing and Kenneth's story keeps shifting. It's a huge red flag, but the police didn't seem to be connecting the dots. They didn't even seem to be suspicious of Kenneth, which is baffling. Things get even stranger when at some point Kenneth is pulled over while driving the very same family van he had claimed was with the rest of the family on vacation. This totally contradicted his previous claims that the family had driven or flown to different locations. It should have been a huge warning sign. Yet the police still didn't put two and two together. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, Everett's parents, Herman and Erling Thompson, were getting more and more worried. They couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. They kept trying to reach their son, but they couldn't get in touch with him. So in late July of 1996, they made the decision to drive to Chicago and search for their son and his family themselves. Their first stop was the restaurant where Everett had worked, Eaton Company. They spoke with the employees and learned that Everett had never returned after that frantic phone call from Lydia. The manager also told them about Kenneth showing up at the restaurant in the family van and about the blood on his shoes. That was the moment the alarm bells went off. Herman and Erling were no longer just worried, they were scared. They immediately called the police, urging them to investigate. Kenneth further, this was the moment when the police began to dig deeper and uncovered that there was no record of an automobile accident or any arrest involving Everett, which Kenneth had previously claimed as the investigation continued. The police also learned that Kenneth had sold the family van to a scrapyard where it was immediately crushed. This meant that any potential evidence the vehicle might have held was lost forever. But the drama didn't stop there. Kenneth had gone even further when he forged his sister's signature to sell the family home, the one that they had all inherited. By the time the police became aware of this illegal sale, the new owners had already taken possession of the house and completely gutted its interior, which basically means that any evidence of foul play that might have been in the house was now lost. However, the investigation took a bizarre turn when the inspector's notes from before the house sale went through revealed something unsettling. The notes said that the kitchen floor had been completely ripped out, and even more strangely, both the bathtub and toilet had been painted red. But when police had visited the house earlier on July 3, right after Lydia's frantic call about Kenneth chasing her with an axe, the officers reported that the kitchen floor was intact and there were no signs of red bathroom fixtures. This meant that all of the changes, like the ripped floor and the red bathroom fixtures, had been made after July 3 and likely after the Thompsons had gone missing. With all of this disturbing new evidence, Kenneth remained the prime suspect in the mysterious disappearance of the Thompsons. But despite all the strange behavior, such as selling the family van, forging his sister's signature to sell the house, the police still didn't make an arrest. It was as if they were waiting for something more, something concrete. And then an entire year passed. Fast forward to July 14, 1997, exactly 1 year after the Thompsons had vanished without a trace. Finally, the police and FBI decided it was time to take action. They searched the trailer where Kenneth had been living in Gary, Indiana, a place about an hour and 15 minutes away from Chicago. The search was intense, with cadaver dogs brought in to sniff out anything that could link Kenneth to the crime. What they uncovered was chilling men's gym shorts and a boy's sock, both soaked in blood. This discovery sent shivers down the spine, but shockingly no arrest was made at that time, and to this day there's no report explaining whose blood was found on those items or what connection they had to the case. It wasn't until later, in November of 1997, that Kenneth was finally arrested, but it wasn't for the disappearance of the Thompsons. Instead, the charges had nothing to do with the family at all. Kenneth was arrested for violating his probation, specifically for failing to register as a sex offender. Then came just a month later, in December of 1997. The FBI had gathered more evidence and Kenneth was arrested once again, this time for forging Lydia's signature on a check for $3,272. That was definitely a serious crime, but it still wasn't enough to answer the most important question: where were the Thompsons while Kenneth was being held at the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago? He tragically took his own life. There was no note left behind and the cause of death was ruled as self-inflicted. The lieutenant later spoke about the case, saying he continued, "If there was foul play, and we think there was, it happened on July 4th, 5th or 6th, 1996. No one saw the Thompson family after that time, and Kenneth was seen driving the Thompson van soon after that weekend. The enormity of an entire family of 4 people missing under such dreadful circumstances demands a continued police presence and review." Despite the lieutenant's statement, it seems like there hasn't been much progress after Kenneth's death. No major updates from the Chicago police or the FBI have been reported, and it doesn't appear that further searches have been conducted to recover the bodies of the Thompson family. What's particularly telling is that none of the Thompsons' social security numbers have been used since they disappeared. Also, Everett and Lydia's credit and bank cards haven't been touched except for the times Kenneth tried to forge checks in Lydia's name. The whole situation surrounding the disappearance of the Thompson family is absolutely mind-blowing. It's shocking how little information has been released, especially given the gravity of the case. When the family first went missing, you'd expect a huge media frenzy, national attention, and all sorts of investigations to unfold, but that's not what happened. The case completely flew under the radar, and it wasn't until after Kenneth's death that people started revisiting the case. Looking back, there was no major search or even a widespread effort to find them. No team of investigators scouring the area, just radio silence. As if that wasn't strange enough, an unnamed police officer later reported that after all the family members had gone missing and Kenneth had committed self-harm, it seemed that the Thompsons, except for Everett, might have used an underground structure to escape from Kenneth. According to this report, the family had fled because they were terrified of Kenneth, who had allegedly been threatening them with an axe. The theory is that they hid out underground to avoid further harm. Now this adds a whole new layer to the mystery. Neighbors reported seeing Everett return to the house several times during the next 12 days after the family's disappearance. He came back at strange hours and his behavior was reportedly odd. One elderly neighbor, a woman named Marie, even spoke to him one night. He allegedly told her that he was searching for his family in the bunker under the house. Marie, thinking he was simply suffering from the grief of losing his loved ones, didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until late in 1997 that she finally spoke out, revealing what she'd heard to a journalist and at least two police officers. Other neighbors also reported seeing Everett bringing things in and out of the house at strange hours. Further adding to the mystery, however, there doesn't seem to be any solid evidence to back up these claims, and no one else has been able to confirm the story. What makes things even more eerie is that the underground structure, the one supposedly used by the family to hide, has not been fully mapped or searched. As of now, it remains an unexplored part of the case. There's also a theory that there's no doubt Kenneth killed the entire family. He had nearly 2 weeks to get rid of the bodies, which some people believe he may have done in a horrific way. One theory is that he dismembered them in the bathtub, especially since the bathtub was later found painted red, which could have been an attempt to hide evidence of what happened. The theory continues, speculating that Kenneth might have thrown the body parts into nearby lakes, fed them to alligators, or even dumped them in old wells. With the kind of disturbing behavior Kenneth displayed, it's not too far-fetched to think he might have gone to extreme lengths to destroy any evidence. Some even wonder if he could have been twisted enough to eat the body parts, a thought that's hard to shake off once you consider his apparent lack of remorse. The fact that he took his own life only adds to the suspicion. His death seems like a reflection of the guilt he carried, though it also leaves the case with more unanswered questions than ever. Unfortunately, with everything that's happened, it seems highly unlikely that any remains will ever be found. The search for answers might just end here, with the gruesome possibility that those answers are buried forever, lost in a trail of blood and secrets that Kenneth took to his grave. Story 3. It was the Christmas season of 1959 when the Walker family, a happy family of 4, went out to run some errands. Christine, the caring mother, decided to come home early to cook a warm dinner for her family while they were still out, but as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with an unknown intruder. This intruder went on to abuse Christine and then shot her, leading to her tragic death. Moments later, her husband Cliff arrived home with their little ones, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. What should have been a joyful reunion quickly turned into a nightmare. Cliff was ambushed and shot without warning, leaving the innocent children defenseless. Jimmy was shot next, and it was reported that he crawled to his father as the killer fired bullet after bullet into his head. Little Debbie faced an even more horrific fate after being shot. She was drowned in the family bathtub. This case remains unsolved to this day, but thanks to new technology we might finally be getting closer to uncovering what really happened to the Walker family. Interestingly, this mystery is also linked to another well-known crime from the same year, a case that shaped the true crime genre as we know it. So if you're curious about who might be responsible for this horrific tragedy, let's dig in and find out more. The story of the Walker family begins in the quiet town of Osprey, located in Sarasota County, Florida, with a population of just over 6,000 people. Osprey was a small, peaceful place where everyone seemed to know each other. Cliff Walker and Christine first met at Arcadia High School, where their personalities couldn't have seemed more different yet fit together perfectly. Cliff was a tall, wiry cowboy known for his love of cool cigarettes. He rarely drank, but his friends could always count on him to be hard-working and dependable. Christine, on the other hand, was full of energy and charm. With her curly light brown hair and bright smile, she was the outgoing, flirty drum major who turned heads wherever she went, and despite having many admirers, Christine fell for Cliff and the two quickly became inseparable. They married young, with Christine at 19 and Cliff at 20. In the 5 years that followed, their family grew, welcoming two children, Jimmy and Debbie, into their lives. Life was simple but joyful for the Walkers. They lived in a small white wood frame house nestled at the end of a winding shell road on Potter Palmer Ranch, a massive property spanning over 14,000 acres. Cliff worked on the ranch, American Samoa, a cow handler, a tough but rewarding job. Their house was modest but felt warm and welcoming, and the Walkers made it a loving home. The ranch was far from crowded, with their closest neighbors living a full mile away, giving them a quiet space to raise their little ones. Though Cliff made a steady income as a ranch hand, they weren't as financially comfortable as some of their friends, and family money wasn't plentiful, but the Walkers valued the simple joys: quiet evenings, shared meals, and watching their two young children grow. Now life on the ranch meant early mornings for the Walker family. Most days the home would already be stirring with activity at dawn, as Cliff would prepare for a long day's work and Christine managed the busy mornings with the children. That's why when a family friend named Don Mloud arrived at their house early on the morning of December 20th, 1959, he expected to find the Walkers up and about, maybe even getting ready for a busy day ahead, but instead he was met with an unsettling silence. Thinking maybe Cliff had just overslept, Don knocked loudly on the back door. When no one answered, he tried again, each knock a little louder than the last. By the time he'd knocked several times with no response, worry began to set in. Finally, feeling something was truly wrong, Don made a difficult choice to cut the screen door, unhook the latch, and enter the silent home. Stepping into the dark kitchen, he switched on the light, hoping he'd find a simple explanation for the strange stillness, but what Don saw next was beyond anything he could have imagined. Just inside the doorway to the living room, he spotted Christine's feet. She was barefoot, lying on the floor, her dress pulled up around her waist. Christine, just 24 years old, had been killed by a gunshot to the head, a wound inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. As Don looked further into the room, his heart sank even more. Cliff was lying on his back, still wearing his cowboy hat. Next to him was their little son, 3-year-old Jimmy, lying close to his dad. Both had been shot in the head with the same weapon. The blood on the floor showed that Jimmy had crawled toward his father, possibly trying to seek comfort. In his moments, Debbie, the Walkers' 2-year-old daughter, was missing from where the rest of her family lay. Alarmed and horrified, he ran out of the house, jumped in his car, and drove a mile to the nearest payphone to call the police. Investigators arrived quickly, and as they searched the house, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Debbie was in the bathroom, lying in the bathtub. She had suffered a gunshot wound, but her actual cause of death was drowning. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, when this tragic murder took place, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office faced an uphill battle. They had no suspects to go on, so they combed through the house, searching for any clues that might reveal who was behind this horrific crime. However, the sheriff's office was small, underfunded, and didn't have enough resources to properly handle such a complex case. As a result, mistakes were made right from the start. Deputies from nearby counties came to help, bringing along bloodhounds, fingerprint experts and ballistic specialists. Yet despite this extra assistance, there were still major obstacles. Sarasota County didn't even have a camera to capture the scene, so news photographers had to be brought in to take crime scene photos, a crucial task usually reserved for investigators to prevent contamination. The presence of so many people coming and going likely disturbed key evidence. For instance, any tire tracks from unfamiliar vehicles could have been destroyed by all the extra activity near the property. However, investigators did find some chilling details connected to the murder. It seemed that Christine was the attacker's first victim, and she put up a fierce fight. She had used her high-heeled shoe to defend herself, leaving traces of her attacker's blood on it. But even with her efforts, the intruder overpowered her, assaulted her, and took her life. Strangely, it looked as though her body had been moved and arranged in the living room afterward, almost as if staged by the killer while combing through the scene. Investigators also found unknown DNA evidence on Christine's clothing, a potential clue pointing to the attacker's identity, and fortunately enough, no similar signs of assault or struggle were found on the other family members. Additionally, several strange items were missing from the Walkers' home after the tragedy. Cliff's pocket knife, Christine's old high school majorette uniform, and even their marriage license. These weren't items a typical burglar would think to take, so police felt they could be clues. They also found disturbing signs left behind, and those are a bloody cowboy boot print on the floor, a partial fingerprint on the bathtub, some spent bullet casings believed to be from the murder weapon, and a cigarette wrapper of a brand no one in the Walker family smoked. In an odd twist, months after the murders, 3 local women stumbled across a pile of bloody clothing in a nearby shed. Among the items were 2 shirts, a skirt, a blouse, pants, and a handkerchief, all belonging to Cliff and Christine. Investigators believed the killer had used these clothes to wipe off blood before leaving the scene. All these clues led detectives to believe that the killer might have been someone familiar to the Walkers. For one, Christine hadn't parked in her usual spot in the driveway that day, hinting that someone else might have already been there. Even more unsettling was that the family's 3 dogs hadn't barked at the intruder. These dogs usually barked at anyone unfamiliar, so their silence suggested that whoever came into the Walker home that day wasn't a stranger to them. And to really understand why Christine was the first victim, investigators interviewed friends and family, gathering details about the Walkers' last day on December 19, 1959. This was just 6 days before Christmas, so the family of 4 headed out around 4 in the afternoon to run a few errands. They picked up cigarettes, sodas, candy, and cattle feed. Christine drove home in the family's 1952 Plymouth, arriving about 30 minutes before Cliff and the kids, who came later in his Jeep. Cliff had been considering a trade for a 1956 Chevrolet Bear with a green and white two-tone finish, and it's possible he was out checking on cars that day. It's possible that's why he and Christine were separated, allowing her to get home just a bit before him. Christine barely had time to hang her purse and put away the groceries before she was ambushed. Police believe that Cliff and the children arrived while the killer was still there, catching them off guard, and that's why they too became victims. One of the biggest challenges for the investigation was that there were simply too many suspects. Detectives interviewed an overwhelming 587 people, which made it hard to narrow down who, if anyone, had a real connection to the murders. And after diving deep into the investigation and examining all the suspects, we put together a list of the most intriguing names without any particular order. Starting with Curtis McCall. At the time of these tragic events, Curtis was just 21 years old and had a past with Christine Walker. They had dated back in high school and rumors suggested that they might have rekindled their relationship shortly before her death. This connection immediately made him a person of interest in the case. What stood out about Curtis was that he owned a .22 caliber pistol, the very same type of weapon used in the murders. Interestingly, locals also painted him as a troublemaker, describing him as a no-good sort of guy who was always stirring up trouble, and according to rumors, after the murders Curtis' demeanor changed noticeably. He became extremely anxious and lost a lot of weight, leading many to wonder if the weight of his actions was starting to catch up with him. It's also important to point out that Curtis had a history of violence. In fact, he had been fired from his job as a dispatcher for the Florida Highway Patrol after an incident where he attacked a man during a traffic stop. His fellow officers had to step in to prevent the situation from escalating, and surprisingly, Curtis didn't even remember what had happened. The investigation led authorities to track Curtis down to the Sumar County courthouse in Georgia, where he was working as a construction foreman at the time. During questioning, he claimed he and Christine were never involved romantically, but he did recall seeing her a few weeks before the murders. Christine and her husband Cliff had stopped by his place to ask about a horse he was selling. This detail seemed innocent enough, but it showed he was still connected to the couple. When questioned about his .22 caliber pistol, Curtis admitted he once owned one but insisted that he had sold it to someone, although he couldn't recall who that was. This inconsistency raised more eyebrows among investigators, and to get to the bottom of things, he underwent a polygraph test to determine his honesty. Initially, he appeared nervous, which could suggest he had something to hide. However, in subsequent tests he seemed more at ease, and the results indicated that he was telling the truth about most of his statements. But there was a catch. When asked if he withheld any information during the questioning, the polygraph results were less clear. It suggested that he might not have been entirely truthful about certain details, leaving investigators wondering what he might be hiding. And as of today, no one knew if Curtis was still alive or what had happened to him. Next is Wilbur Tucker. Tucker was a 65-year-old retired railroad worker who lived just a mile southwest of the Walkers. He was once a familiar face in their home, dropping by often to chat and share stories, but his visits took a troubling turn as his behavior became more inappropriate, creating tension and discomfort within the family. It was reported that Christine Walker found herself increasingly uneasy around Tucker. She confided in her mother about her fears, expressing how much she dreaded being near him. This was not just a passing concern, it was a deep-rooted fear that Tucker might cross boundaries that no one should ever cross. Several family members and friends later recalled incidents where Tucker had tried to kiss Christine or even coax her into bed. His actions were persistent enough that Christine felt she had to tell her husband Cliff about them so obviously. Cliff was furious when he heard what Tucker had been doing. He wanted to confront the older man and put an end to it, but Christine, worried about potential trouble, persuaded him to hold back. Even so, Cliff made it clear to Tucker that he was no longer welcome in their home and warned him not to come around anymore. Unfortunately, that warning seemed to fall on deaf ears. In the aftermath of the Walker family's tragic fate, Tucker's behavior raised even more suspicions. His friend William Hosmer revealed that Tucker was angry with Christine after her death, constantly talking about her in a way that made others uncomfortable. This strange obsession only added to the unsettling nature of Tucker's character. He often visited the Walker home, claiming he was gathering evidence to protect himself, which only fueled the investigation into his actions on the day of the murders. Detectives retraced Tucker's movements. He had gone out to dinner with a friend from around 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., but there was a significant gap in his timeline between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m., just when the Walkers were brutally murdered. Tucker had no solid alibi. After dinner, he showed up at Bradinon High School by 7:45 p.m. to Play the violin with the school orchestra. Investigators spoke with his fellow musicians to see if they noticed anything strange about Tucker that evening, but no one could confirm any odd behavior. Sadly, Tucker passed away in March 1963, leaving behind a trail of questions and an unsettling feeling surrounding the Walker family's tragic fate. Then we have Albert Walker, who happened to be Cliff's cousin from the very beginning. Albert's reaction to the tragic death of the Walker family raised eyebrows. At the funeral, he didn't just shed a few tears. He wailed loudly, almost as if he were putting on a performance. It got so intense that he fainted and had to be carried out of the service. This dramatic display left many family members feeling uneasy, leading them to suspect that Albert was simply faking his grief for attention. Some even told investigators that he was putting on a show to draw focus to himself. Albert had a reputation for being wild, especially when he drank. Family members whispered that he secretly had feelings for Christine, which made his behavior all the more suspicious. After the funeral, his actions only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Whenever anyone mentioned the crime, Albert would suddenly leave the room, refusing to engage in conversations about the tragedy that had befallen his family. Growing up, Albert and Cliff were close. In fact, Albert had even lived with the Walker family for a time after separating from the military, which made his sudden withdrawal from discussions about the murders seem all the more troubling. When investigators decided to question Albert, he cooperated fully, undergoing a polygraph test which he passed. However, on the day the bodies were discovered, Albert claimed he had come to Osprey from Walshula to discuss a Christmas party that Cliff was supposedly planning. Investigators later learned this story was untrue, as Cliff had not planned any party and was actually going to Arcadia for the holidays. When Albert arrived in Osprey that day, he dropped off a friend at the Ohio bar before heading to a nearby gas station, where he approached two men. One of the men noticed that Albert's eyes were red and thought he looked like he had a rough night. Albert asked, "Do you know where Cliff Walker lives?" This question struck them as strange because Albert had lived at the Walker's house for months after leaving the military in 1958. He was familiar with the area and had attended many family cookouts and gatherings. One of the men at the gas station eventually told Albert the heartbreaking news: the Walker family had been murdered. When Albert arrived at the Walker home, he acted as if he had just heard the news for the first time. He sobbed uncontrollably, leaning over the hood of Christine's parked car, burying his head in his arms. In September of 1962, investigators revisited their focus on Albert, tracking him down in Ridgely, Tennessee, where he was working as a migrant farm worker. They first spoke with Albert's 17-year-old girlfriend Johnny Rainey and her brother. They revealed that although Albert often talked about the rest of the Walker family, he had never mentioned Christine. Johnny said that Albert appeared visibly disturbed when he talked about Cliff, while her brother noted that Albert was crying like a baby as he spoke about Debbie, Cliff's daughter, being drowned in the bathtub. Albert had even told him that Jimmy, Cliff's son, didn't die immediately because he crawled up to his daddy and died. This detail raised eyebrows among investigators, as there were no reports mentioning Jimmy crawling, only that he had died huddled next to his father. Albert was questioned and hooked up to a polygraph machine, which he passed. However, in 1987, Lieutenant Max Schemes, the polygraph expert for the sheriff's office, expressed doubts about the reliability of old polygraphs. He explained that technology had significantly improved since then, and training back in the day was often minimal. During a meeting about the Walker case, detectives brought in Ellis Denham, an expert who had dedicated much of his career to solving the case. They asked him who his top suspect had been before he retired in 1975. Without hesitation, Denham replied, "Albert Walker." After this revelation, detectives brought Albert to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and connected him to the latest polygraph machine. Once again, Albert passed the test, and Lieutenant Dario Valenti, who was part of the investigation concluded in his report that Albert Walker is not responsible for the Walker murders. He added that Albert had been extremely cooperative and appreciated the ongoing concern regarding the investigation. Despite passing the polygraph test and maintaining his innocence, Valenti noted that this wouldn't be the last time Albert would be questioned about the murders. 15 years from now somebody is going to come along and probably do everything that we did all over again, Valenti predicted. Next we have Butch Dennis. A woman came forward to the police and claimed that Dennis had boasted about killing the Walkers. According to her, he said his father helped him cover it up by burying his cowboy boots, which allegedly had blood from the Walkers on them. Butch's father passed a polygraph exam, however there is no indication that Butch was ever questioned in relation to the Walker murders. Then there's the meter reader Stanley Mock. Stanley Mock left his Brinks Avenue home to read meters for the electric company. He exchanged pleasantries with some families whose homes were on his route and played golf in his spare time, but a troubled mind lurked behind his everyman exterior. Before the Walker murders, he enlisted the help of a psychiatrist to quash an uncontrollable urge to kill his wife and 2 small children. From the beginning of the Walker investigation, detectives were drawn to Stanley, eager to solve the case. They discovered he had also been linked to another mysterious crime that had occurred a few months earlier. A young University of Florida student named Chandler Stevens had been found dead in his apartment, tied up, tortured, and left for dead in a gruesome scene that became known as the Mummy murder. As the detectives dug deeper, they learned that Stanley's meter route included the very apartment complex where Stevens had lived. The coincidences piled up when they found out he also read the meter for the Walker house. Yet despite the unsettling connections, investigators never uncovered any concrete evidence to link him to either crime. In a recent interview, Mary Mock, Stanley's widow, revealed how her husband had been deeply affected by the Walker family's deaths. He had known the children and felt a special bond with them during his meter readings. The news of their brutal murder shattered him when he saw it in the paper in 1959. It just about killed him, she recalled, explaining how he would often wander the streets at night, overcome with grief. Following the murders, Stanley suffered a complete breakdown and underwent electroshock therapy. His fear of hurting his own family haunted him, leaving him anxious and shaken during his work. Though Mary never knew her husband had been considered a suspect in the Walker case, she firmly believed in his innocence. "I'm positive in my heart he could never do something like that," she said, defending the man she knew and loved. There are also reports suggesting that a man named M. Monroe Spencer confessed to the murders of the Walker family. However, Sarasota County Sheriff Ross Burr quickly discredited Spencer's confession, labeling him a pathological liar. The sheriff revealed that Spencer's claims were not genuine. Instead, they appeared to be cleverly constructed from real murders he had read about in newspapers and true crime novels he enjoyed. In an intriguing twist, in 1994, a bartender from Stratford, Pennsylvania reached out to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office with a tip. She claimed that one of her customers had boasted about killing the Walker family. Unfortunately, this lead was never verified, and to this day the case remains open. However, perhaps the most infamous figures potentially connected to this tragedy are Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the notorious duo involved in the Clutter family murders, which gained significant attention in Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood. If you've read this gripping book, you might remember a part that connects to the Walker family, highlighting eerie similarities between the two cases. The Clutter family was brutally killed by Hickok in Smith and Holcomb, Kansas in 1959, just 34 days before the Walker family met a similar fate. If you want to dive deeper into the details of this case, we have another video on it, and the link will be in the description box below. What ties these two cases together is that after killing the Clutter family, Smith and Hickok escaped to Florida in a stolen car. They were spotted at least a dozen times between Tallahassee and Miami. The pair checked into a motel in Miami Beach about 4 hours away from Osprey and left the morning of the Walker murders. On that same day they shopped at a department store in Sarasota just a few miles from the Walker home. One witness noted that the taller man had a scratched face. The duo was arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada on December 30, 1959 for the Clutter murders, and they were executed by hanging on April 14, 1965. Although a polygraph test seemed to clear them of the Walker murders, some experts argue that the machines from the early 60s were often unreliable. The sheriff's office acknowledged that Hickok and Smith were considered suspects as early as 1960. Records show that the Walkers were looking to buy a 1956 Chevrolet Bear which matched the stolen car that Smith and Hickok were using in Florida. This raises the possibility that they entered the Walker home under the pretense of selling the car. In December 2012, investigators in Sarasota County announced plans to exhume the bodies of Smith and Hickok from Mount Muni Cemetery. They hope to extract mitochondrial DNA from the bones to compare with semen found at the Walker home. The bodies were exhumed and DNA was collected. Kansas authorities stated they would prioritize processing the DNA from active cases, which could take weeks or even months. By August 2013, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office announced that they found no match between the DNA of either Perry Smith or Richard Hickok and the samples from the Walker murder. Only partial DNA was retrieved, possibly due to degradation or contamination over the years, leaving the outcome uncertain. Therefore, Smith and Hickok remain the prime suspects. However, based on the stolen items, Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist, believes it's unlikely they were the killers and suspects that the murderer knew at least one member of the Walker family. With all that being said, it seems like a crazy coincidence that these two notorious family murders were in the exact same place at the same time. But then if you consider the personal items that went missing, like the marriage certificate and Christine's drum uniform, it makes no sense for a stranger to want these items unless they were taken as trophies, yet they weren't found on Hickok and Smith when they were arrested. Story 4. Imagine returning home expecting your family to be safe and sound, only to find everything completely burned to the ground. For Harish Kumar, this nightmare became his tragic reality. He came home to utter devastation. The house he'd built with his own hard work was now nothing but ashes, and even worse, his loved ones were gone, taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable. But the pain didn't stop. Their heirs had a gut feeling about who was behind this unimaginable act, and now it all comes down to us asking the same question. Why? Today we're diving deep into every chilling detail of this case, piecing together the clues to uncover the dark truth behind the motive. Because when someone murders an entire family, ties them up, beats them and sets them on fire without any clear reason, well, you're dealing with a psychopath. Plain and simple. To start with, Harish Kumar was the kind of guy who always put in the work. He wasn't one to sit around waiting for things to happen, because obviously he made things happen. Back in the late 1970s, Harish decided to take a huge leap. He packed up his family and moved them to the United States, chasing the dream of a better life. His wife, Gay Kumar, was no stranger to hard work either. If anything, she matched him step for step. They balanced each other out perfectly. Hairs had the vision and drive, while Jita had the steady, practical mindset that kept everything grounded. But of course they didn't have it easy. Like any immigrant family, they faced their fair share of struggles, such as long hours, sacrifices and tough decisions. But through it all, they refused to let anything stop them. Before we move on, I wanted to take some time to talk about this video sponsor, Aura, which has become a really big deal lately because hackers may have just stolen the social security numbers of every American. You may not have heard, but over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which provides personal information to employers and Others doing background checks, and these records don't just include surface level information either, like I had originally assumed when I first heard about this, but instead they include information like a person's full name, address, date of birth, phone number, and most importantly their social security number, and different members of hacker groups around have reportedly released this information for completely free online. This is an extreme breach of privacy, and hearing about this I'm honestly surprised it didn't make as much news as it did. Thankfully I don't have to worry about breaches like this because I use Aura. Aura is constantly monitoring your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to detect and alert you to potential identity theft. They even give you up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. I also get things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus, a password manager, and a lot more. I get this all in one app at one affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/into the deep. Their relentless hard work started to pay off when in the 1990s they took another big step forward and bought a rundown hotel in the Studio City area. Ever since then, Hares and Jita put their hearts into renovating the property, turning it into a shiny new hotel. They worked day and night making sure every detail was perfect, and it didn't take long before they started seeing the rewards of their hard work. The Kumars soon expanded their success, developing a whole chain of hotels. Life seemed picture perfect for them. In fact, they had it all: a thriving business, a loving home, and two wonderful kids, Paris, their 18-year-old son, and Tulsi, their 16-year-old daughter. They were enjoying the fruits of their labor, feeling like they had finally reached the peak of what they'd worked so hard for. At that time, Harish's mother-in-law Sitaben Patel, who was 63, also lived with them, and according to some she was the backbone of the family, making sure the kids were well taken care of, while Hares and Jita focused on running the business. Saitan was there to ensure everything ran smoothly at home, giving the couple the freedom to grow their business without worrying about their children. But here's the thing: if you're a business owner, you know you're never truly alone. There are always rivals, competitors ready to outdo you, challenge you, or even try to bring you down, and Hares and Jita were no exception. This is where Victor Govan enters the story. Just like Harish and Ga, Victor was also a business owner, running a small rundown hotel right next to the one the Kumar family had worked so hard to build. The two hotels were in the same area of Los Angeles, and believe it or not, their dispute started over something that seemed pretty minor: a back alley. Victor had blocked off the alley to expand his property, but Jita needed that same alley to run her business properly. Naturally, tensions rose, and before long, the Department of City Planning got involved to try to sort things out. But according to Hares, it wasn't anything serious at first. It seemed like a simple problem about a back alley, something that could easily be resolved. He never expected it to lead to what was about to come next. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. On May 4, 2002, that's when Harish Kumar decided to step outside of his home to take a breather. That evening everything seemed like any other normal day. Hares had been working hard as usual and decided to take a break by going out to play volleyball with his friends. He walked out of the house with no worries, thinking that his family was safe and sound inside. His wife Jita was home, along with his mother-in-law Siddhan and their two kids Paras and Tulsi. By just after 11 p.m. Hares returned home from his game, ready to relax and get some rest. As he pulled into the driveway, he was struck by an unimaginable sight. His home, the place where he had built so many memories with his family, was on fire. Without a second thought, Hares rushed toward the front door, instinctively trying to get inside to rescue his loved ones, but the heat was unbearable. The thick smoke and intense flames blocked his every move. It was impossible to get through his heart raced as panic set in, knowing that the people he loved most were inside and there was nothing he could do to save them. So Harish quickly pulled out his phone and dialed 911, desperately reporting the fire, and within moments, the fire department arrived at the single-family residence in Hollywood Hills, Los Angeles. But the heartbreaking truth was more than Harish could bear. After the flames were finally controlled and the smoke began to clear, detectives made a chilling discovery. This wasn't just a tragic accident, it had been set intentionally, as if the devastation of losing his home wasn't enough. Harish's world was turned upside down when authorities revealed the most horrifying detail of all: his family had been killed before the fire was even set. According to official reports, his family was found in one single room and their bodies were burned beyond recognition. The charred remains were unmistakably those of his wife Geeta, their son Parts, their daughter Tulsi, and Harish's mother-in-law Sidhan Patel. The scene inside that room was one that would haunt anyone who laid eyes on it. According to investigators, all four victims had been hog-tied, their hands and feet bound tightly together with cords and their mouths sealed with duct tape. This method of restraint was a glaring sign that something far more sinister had occurred. As Detective Pi Tranon noted, that is an obvious indication that foul play was involved. The victims had clearly suffered before their lives were taken. Jay Moberly, a former LAPD homicide detective, described the gruesome scene, saying they had obviously endured immense heat. He recalled how one of the bodies had a leg burned off up to the knee, further evidence of the severe, relentless heat that had consumed them. Initially, Hares was the first one to come under suspicion. After all, it seemed strange that he wasn't at home when his entire family was there, especially at night. The investigators wondered, how could he have not been around when all this happened? However, Harish quickly provided a solid alibi. He had been playing volleyball with his friends at the time, which was verified by others. He wasn't at the scene when the tragedy unfolded. But there was one thing Hares mentioned during his questioning that really stuck with the detectives. He brought up their ongoing dispute with Victor Govan, the same man we mentioned earlier who had clashed with GA over a back alley. As the investigation progressed, new clues began to emerge. Surveillance footage from a nearby house showed that a gray truck had been spotted in the area before and after the fire had started. This piece of evidence raised a lot of questions. What was this truck doing near the scene of the crime? Even more concerning was the fact that when police looked closer, they realized the truck had no license plate. The police immediately began trying to track down the unmarked vehicle, hoping it would lead them to the culprit. But in the meantime, they continued to piece together evidence at the crime scene. As part of their investigation, detectives walked through the house with Hares, knowing he could provide any further insights. When they reached the room where his family had been found, Harish pointed out that some things were missing, most notably his wife's case of jewelry, which had contained valuable pieces and around $5,000 in cash were gone. But despite the missing valuables, investigators were quick to dismiss the idea that this was a simple robbery gone wrong. The crime scene told a much darker story, one filled with hatred and malice. As the investigation deepened, the autopsies revealed even more disturbing details that sent chills down everyone's spine. The victims had been burned alive, something that was confirmed by the smoke found in their lungs. But the horror didn't stop there. GA and Tulsi, the mother and daughter, both had injuries to their throats, and just when it seemed like the case couldn't get any more twisted, a new lead came to light. Rod Burnson, a former LAPD sergeant and crime reporter for Fox 11, reached out to detectives with some shocking information. He had received a call from an anonymous tipster who claimed to know who was behind the gruesome quadruple murder and the arson. Burnson managed to convince the tipster, named Angelberto Noah, to meet with investigators and provide more details. Angel revealed that 6 weeks before the murders, he had been approached by someone to intimidate a few people into signing some contracts. Angel didn't know all the details, but he knew that he would be working with two men, one named Pedro who drove a gray truck and another named Freddy. As the investigators listened carefully, they learned that the targets of this scheme had been the Kumars, but things didn't go as planned, and whatever arrangement or deal they had with the Kumars fell apart. The plot thickened when Angel identified one of the men, Freddy, as Victor Govan, the very business rival Hares had mentioned earlier, but the twists kept coming. Detective work led them to another man named Carlos Amidir, who had a gray pickup truck registered in his name. The investigators dug into Amador's history and uncovered some unsettling details. He had a record of minor offenses, but what really stood out was that some of those offenses had been committed alongside none other than Peter Govan, Victor's brother. This was the link that investigators needed to connect the dots. Victor Govan, his brother, and their associates were now the primary suspects in what seemed like a carefully orchestrated act of vengeance. Now Peter Govan's criminal record added another layer of intrigue to the investigation. 7 years earlier he had been convicted for assault with a firearm, yet somehow he had received less than 2 years in jail for the crime. The leniency of his sentence didn't sit well with investigators, who now saw Peter's violent tendencies as part of a bigger pattern, but it was the Govans' business ambitions that truly caught their attention. The Govans had massive expansion plans tied to the disputed alleyway. If they won the rights to it, it would have meant millions of dollars for their business. According to Moberly, this alley was more than just a small plot of land. It was a key to the future of the Govans' empire, and it seemed like the Kumars were standing in their way. But what really fueled the anger between the two families wasn't just about business, it was about who was in charge. Investigators discovered that the Govans were enraged by the fact that Harish Kumar had deferred to his wife Geeta during their discussions about the alley. We determined that both Victor and his brother were incensed by the fact that they had to talk to Geeta, said Pirani. The simple act of respect of allowing GA to handle negotiations seemed to have sparked the bitter hatred between the families. The timing of the dispute was also crucial. A hearing was scheduled for May 10, just 6 days after the murders, to decide the fate of the alleyway. Would the Kumar or the Govans win? According to Fatal Family Feuds, the outcome would have been pivotal. Investigators spoke with city planners, who confirmed that Geeta would likely have been granted full access to the alley, and Victor Govan would have been forced to remove any illegal structures he had set up there. This potential loss, combined with the growing animosity, could have been the final straw for the Goss. In their pursuit of justice, investigators turned to a more covert approach. They tapped the phones of Victor and Peter Govan, as well as their associate Amidir, pretending to be auto theft detectives. They managed to speak with Amidir and get the VIN number of his truck, the same truck that had been seen in the area around the time of the fire. Around this time, another tipster came forward with crucial information. The witness revealed that Amador had confessed to them about a meeting with 2 of his Indian friends at a house, claiming they had gone there to get some documents signed, but according to Amadori, things got out of hand. The tipster said that Amidir mentioned seeing someone's face, and then, in a chilling turn of events, one of the Govan brothers had ordered that everyone in the house be killed and the house set on fire to cover up the crime. This bombshell revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, but the breakthroughs didn't stop there. The police tracked down a third witness, another individual who admitted that he'd been asked by Amidir to act as an alibi. It seemed that Amadori was deeply entangled in the Govans' plot and now had no choice but to cooperate with the authorities. Eventually Amidir was apprehended by the LAPD. After being interrogated, he agreed to testify against the Govan brothers, painting a terrifying picture of the events leading up to the brutal murders. According to Amador, he had been there when the Kumar family was ambushed. He described how the victims were tied up, beaten and brutally threatened before Victor Govan, who Amador referred to as Virendra, ordered that they be killed. The killers then doused the entire house with flammable liquid, setting it ablaze to ensure that no evidence would remain. By late July, investigators had reason to believe that the Govans, aware that Amadori had been in contact with the authorities, might be Planning to kill their co-conspirator. This added an even darker layer to the case. Not only had they orchestrated the brutal murder of the Kumar family, but they might also be willing to eliminate anyone who could potentially turn on them. After 4 intense weeks of deliberations, the jury finally reached a verdict for Victor Govan, but they couldn't agree on his brother Peter. The jury foreperson shared that 9 jurors were ready to acquit Peter, while 3 jurors believed he should be convicted. With the split, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell declared a mistrial in Peter's case, meaning they would have to start over with a new trial for him. As the court read the verdict for Victor, he remained eerily calm. His eyes stayed downcast, showing no emotion. It was like he wasn't fazed by the gravity of what was happening. Meanwhile, Harish, who had lost his entire family in such a brutal way, was utterly devastated. He was heartbroken beyond words, but still found the strength to speak out about how he never could have imagined Victor could do something so cruel. His voice shook as he said, "Victor was my neighbor and we were really close. I never thought he would have such a vicious mind to do such a thing." During the same court session, Amador stepped forward and shared what he had seen that night. He told the court in detail how he watched Victor Govan strangle the Kumar family members while Peter Govan joined in the violent attack. But not everyone was buying into Amador's story. The defense team worked hard to undermine his credibility, calling him a liar and even suggesting that he might have been the one who masterminded the whole thing. Victor Govan's lawyer, Richard Steingard, tried to argue that there was no real business dispute between the families and insisted there was no concrete evidence connecting Victor to the crime beyond Amador's testimony. Meanwhile, Peter Govan's attorney, John E. Sweeney, focused on the lack of solid evidence to convict Peter other than what Amador had said. Sweeney went as far as calling Ader a disgusting, pathetic psychopath, trying to paint him as untrustworthy. But then again, that's what defense attorneys are. Therefore, to stand by the suspect after 2 years of courtroom drama, Victor Govan was convicted and sentenced to death just before Christmas in 2004. Amador, on the other hand, pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder back in 2003, receiving a life sentence. Fast forward on April 4, 2005, and the jury found Peter Govan guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, confirming that he'd committed the crimes for financial gain during a robbery and burglary and in a brutal multiple murder spree. Just like his brother, Peter was sentenced to death tragically. Harish Kumar passed away just a few months after the trial wrapped up. Some say he may have followed his family in spirit, finally at peace knowing those responsible were brought to justice. But again, we're not done yet. While on death row, Victor Govan, 51, was found in his cell at 10:15 p.m. in 2018 and was pronounced dead at 10:30 p.m. His death occurred 2 days after Orange County serial killer Andrew Urdiales, 54, was also found dead in his cell. It's a chilling pattern that more death row inmates seem to die by their own hands than by execution. So if you're curious about the case of Andrew Urdiales, let us know in the comments, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the Kumar massacre too. Story 5. This is Ermelinda Palomo, a woman that authorities suspected was somehow involved in the deaths of a family of 4 in Romeoville, Illinois. The family consisted of 32-year-old Zoretta Bartle, her husband 38-year-old Alberto Roland, their 2 boys 7-year-old Diego and 9-year-old Adriel, and even the 3 family dogs. What did Palomo have to do with their deaths? That's a question we'll seek to answer today. Though the answer might surprise you, another question at the heart of this story involves Palomo's live-in boyfriend, 31-year-old Nathaniel Huey Jr. This horrifying saga has more twists and turns than you'd expect, revealing years of emotional manipulation and abuse that culminated in a quadruple homicide that shocked the community of Romeoville, Illinois. But first, we must understand the couple at the center of it all. There was a lot that was strange about Palomo and Huey. For starters, Palomo was nearly 20 years older than Huey, while this Might not be the strangest thing in the world. It was clear that Huey wasn't satisfied with his girlfriend, and there's a chance that it was because of their age gap. We know about his dissatisfaction because Palamo herself claimed that Huey cheated on her constantly, and he would frequently lie about it and try to cover up his actions. For Palamo's part, she was the sort of person that wasn't afraid to manipulate others, especially to get what she wanted. Her dynamic with Huey was toxic to say the least, and the fact that he was cheating on her only made her mental health spiral further out of control. Anyone on the outside looking in would have seen Palamo and Huey and seen a regular couple, but the truth was there was a nauseating streak of toxicity that ran through their entire dynamic. Perhaps the most striking example of this was Palamo creating fake social media profiles and messaging Huey through them. This is a bit of a chicken and the egg type of situation. Did Palamo start doing this before Huey started cheating? Potentially as a way of making sure her younger boyfriend didn't leave her, or was this a response to his infidelity? There's no way to know, but the content of these pretend conversations shed some light on just how bizarre Palamo could be and how utterly divorced from reality she was making her boyfriend. It's fair to say that Palamo was a vengeful woman who wasn't afraid to protect what she thought was hers. Before we get into how Palamo slowly manipulated Huey's very sense of reality, we must discuss the woman that he'd recently become involved with. Her name was Ziradu Bartolome, and she lived in Romeoville as well. Romeoville isn't a very big town with just a few tens of thousands of residents. It's the sort of place where word travels fast. At the same time, it also means that there are fewer romantic partners to choose from. This shouldn't be an issue for someone that lives with his girlfriend, and if Palamo's testimonies to be taken seriously, engaged in planning to marry that person. Even so, when Ziradu walked into Huey's office one day in 2022, he just couldn't resist talking to her. Huey had a history of infidelity that stretched all the way back to the start of his relationship with Palamo. The first time he stepped out on Palamo was back in 2015, and over the next 2 years he cheated on her time and time again until she at least confronted him in 2017. Huey begged Palamo to forgive him and promised to change his ways for good, and Palamo decided to give him a chance. There were still some signs that Huey wanted experiences with women other than his girlfriend. In 2019 he reportedly confessed to her that he'd kissed a woman at a party, but claimed that that was all that happened. Once again, Palamo chose to forgive him, and their fragile relationship continued. It's unknown if Huey had relationships with any other women prior to 2022, but when he met Ziradu, everything changed. In the past, his relationships had been flings and one-off encounters, and that's exactly how he thought things would go with Sato as well. Even so, their relationship continued for over a year, during which time Huey got more and more attached to his secret partner. It bears mentioning that Ziradu had a family of her own, namely a husband, 2 kids and 3 dogs. In intimate moments, Ziradu often confessed that she wasn't truly happy in her marriage. That's not to say that Alberto was a bad man, far from it. In Zirat's own words, he was kind, generous, and a good husband all around. There was just something about the marriage that wasn't working for her, and her relationship with Huey seemed to fill that absence. Bit by bit, Huey and Zirat's relationship began to turn into something more than just a fling. She started confiding in him, and they apparently texted and called every day. They also worked for the same engineering company where Huey worked as a security guard, so they clearly spent a lot of time together. And every night when Huey would head home from work, he would call Ziradu so that they could talk some more. Were Huey and Ziradu in love? It's a fair assumption, one that makes the gruesome climax of this story all the more difficult to stomach. One would certainly say that they were in love, and Ziradu surely believed it, or at least she believed it, until September 15, 2023. That marked the first time that Ziradu texted Huey, only for him to Not reply. This had never happened before. Why would he ignore her like this? The answer lies in Palomo's discovery of the affair and the absolutely twisted way she decided to handle it when Huey promised never to cheat on Paloma again. She wanted to believe him, but at the same time she knew that he might just be saying that to get out of the conversation, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. She started by making a series of fake social media accounts through which she established contact with Huey. There's a chance that she initially wanted to make sure that her boyfriend wasn't getting tempted by other women, but sometime in July of 2023, something happened that made her kick things up a notch. Zorado texted Huey while he was in the car with Paloma. When she saw the message, her worst fears were confirmed. He was cheating on her yet again, and she had to do everything she could to stop it. This is when Paloma started posing as Mexican and Bulgarian drug cartel members. It was a strange choice to say the least, but it was all part of her larger plan to take Zorado out of commission and finally have Huey all to herself. She pretended to be the leader of a cartel and led Huey to believe he was working for him. It's possible that Huey took part in various activities, all the while believing that he was doing it on behalf of a powerful cartel leader, and then one day this supposed cartel leader told him something that shook Huey to its very core. He told him that Zorado, the woman he'd been sleeping with and even thinking of moving in with at some point, was a mole. She was someone put into play by the authorities to keep tabs on Huey. In other words, she was an enemy that needed to be taken out. You can tell how tenuous Huey's grasp on reality was by this point, because he believed every single word. He was given a list of instructions to follow, and on September 15th he cut off all contact with Zorado as he put the plan into motion. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. In the early hours of September 17th, Romeoville police received a call requesting a welfare check on Zorado and Alberto's home. They headed to the home and started to look around with no clue of what they might find. Welfare checks often don't lead to anything shocking, so police had no reason to believe there was anything to worry about. However, something was rather odd. If you pay close attention to the footage, you'll see that the lights in most of the homes were on, and yet Zorado's home was pitch black. This forced officers to shine a light in through the window, at which point they discovered a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. A coffee table and TV knocked over. This was a clear indication that some violence had occurred in the home, but police had no way to know what had happened. Was this a burglary, a case of violence perhaps, or could this be a sign that someone had been killed in this home? The fact that the lights were off was suspicious, especially considering it was a Sunday night. Bit by infinite decimal bit, the situation was getting increasingly intense. Eventually officers found a way to gain entry into the residence. The back door was unlocked, a detail which would prove extremely important to the investigation later on. For now, it gave the police a way to enter what they were quickly starting to believe might be an active crime scene. The sight of a dead dog is enough to make anyone's stomach churn, even a cop that's probably seen far worse things. Immediately the officer in charge starts to escalate his response to the situation, requesting more units in a voice that captures the air of urgency that was now required. You see, 2 dead dogs wouldn't just be left lying around like that. The fact that they lay unburied suggested that something terrible had happened to their owners as well. Realizing that this was a much more dangerous situation than he previously thought, the officer calls in the details and heads for his vehicle. We now have knocked over furniture and 2 dead dogs, a clear sign of not just a struggle but a potentially fatal encounter. The officer pulls out a tactical shield, since there was a chance that an armed suspect might emerge at any moment. A rifle is retrieved from the police vehicle, with the officer fully intending to use lethal force if necessary. He has no idea if there's someone in the house or if they're going to get involved in a gunfight. He positions his backup officers and prepares to go in. Zarida's home had just become one of the most dangerous places in the entire town. Hey, no, you're behind me. Okay, you stay in the back of the stack, you watch R6 as we move through the house. Okay, Christian, here, I got one, check the door here. Cover the window. What do you see? Corey, move up. How many dead dogs you got? We got one dead dog right here. We got a second dead dog right here. Alright, watch out. Hey, why don't you check the door handle first inside the house? Police found not just 2 dead dogs but Zarida and her entire family brutally murdered. A total of 20 shots had been fired and even the children hadn't been spared. Police immediately began investigating the tragedy and it didn't take them very long to find out about Zarida's involvement with Huey. The following Monday, Huey went to work like he always did. His mood showed no major changes and Palamo behaved perfectly normal as well. At first, police suspected that the murders were part of a robbery gone wrong. This assumption was strengthened by the fact that there was spray paint on the walls. As it turned out, this was all part of Palamo's design. Upon discovering text messages between Zarida and Huey, police arrived at Palamo's home on September 18. I know you were talking on the phone with your husband right now. Husband or boyfriend? Does he live here with you? How long have you guys been together? 2015. Okay, we're investigating a murder. Okay, Palamo tried to pretend that she didn't know anything about the murders, but police already knew that Huey was involved and they knew that Palamo was in on it. Somehow they take her into their car and start to interrogate her, paying close attention to her answers. How long have you known Huey? Since probably 2015. Okay. Why are you scared of him? Oh, I'm not scared. Okay, why are you scared right now? Because when I called him, because I was scared, I didn't know where he was. He said someone's following me. Okay, so I called and then I heard him say, why are you following me? Do you want to search the car? And then someone said to him, there are messages from you and it's because her husband found out you were having an affair. And I didn't know that you didn't know that he was having an affair. Okay, from the sounds of things, Huey was being tracked as well. Paloma was trying to make it seem like Zarida's husband had found out about the affair, potentially in an attempt to pin the blame on him. In fact, the entire story she told the officers seemed to be one long rehearsed alibi. Meanwhile, police headed to Huey's workplace to ask him a few questions as well. So we were talking with the bosses and they said, well, we already went through the phones, they've already got one half of the conversation. And you said you talked to her on your phone, right? Okay, so what we're asking for is consent to get the text messages off your phone between you and her to Snapchat or whatever it is between you and her, so we have both sides of it trying to eliminate you as a suspect. But Huey seemed unwilling to comply with this simple request. He seemed to want to get his hands on his phone at all times because he wasn't sure the police would like what they found when they looked into it. We're done with it. I agree with you, but again, it would take us, a couple hours to pull information out of the phone that could eliminate you as a suspect, right from the start. It's up to you. Eventually Huey agrees to go to the police station after work, where he ends up having an even less productive conversation with them. Alright, well, I'm not trying to ruin your marriage or life, so I'm not I'm going to I'll try to keep this if we can, from just with us in this room talking, but we're trying to figure out what happened at that house. Did she ever told you about any other romantic relationships you had out of her marriage, he or her? Did she say her husband's cheating on her, or did she say she never even passed anything? When you leave this room, we're not calling your work anything. It's none of their business. This is our conversation, so it's up to you, whatever you want to tell them. Obviously we talked to her family, we talked to friends and stuff. That's why we're here and that's why we're sitting in this room talking to you. And I got to ask, do you have anything to do with it? Once again, Huey didn't budge. He didn't want the cops knowing anything about what he'd done, but police had already figured out what had happened over the course of their investigation. While Palamao was being interrogated, she concocted a story about Huey being asleep on Friday night after the two of them drank large amounts of alcohol. She and Huey didn't sleep in the same bed, with Palamao claiming he slept in the garage. According to her version of events, her daughter's boyfriend saw Huey sleep in at around 5:00 a.m. on Saturday morning, which would have been roughly the time that Zerida and her family were killed. She was trying her best to create an alibi for her boyfriend, but police could tell that she was lying. Okay, if he were to leave in the middle of the night one day, would it be safe to say that you probably would have not known? No, I think everybody knows when he leaves, because when you slam our door, the front door, you don't even have to slam it like you hear it in the house. It's fragile, you hear everything. So no, especially like maybe if I would like Friday night, maybe because we were drinking, and if I would have passed out on Friday 2 in the morning, maybe he could have done that, but I was already had been sleeping off hangover. So did you go anywhere Saturday night then? No, I was home. Well, it wasn't night, it was afternoon. No, I did not, I was here. Are you telling me the truth? According to police reports, Palamao convinced Huey that Zerida was a mole who was out to kill him, believing himself to be working for a cartel. Huey knew that he had to get to Zerida first, so he asked Palamao to drive him up to Zerida's residence. It was apparently Palamo's idea to make the quadruple homicide seem like a robbery gone wrong, and to use spray paint to make it look like kids had done it, though she sent these instructions through her cartel leader persona at around 3:17 a.m. on September 16. Palamao and Huey arrived at Zerida's home. Huey cut a hole in a window but then entered through the unlocked back door. The first person he confronted was Alberto, who tried to tackle him but was shot multiple times. Following this, he killed Zerida and the boys along with the dogs. Everyone suffered multiple gunshot wounds. After finishing the job, Huey came back out. He and Palamao drove back home. They pretended like nothing happened over the next few days, but when police started to close in, they knew they only had one option to run. Huey and Palamao left Illinois, prompting police to conduct a nationwide manhunt for him. They were eventually spotted on security cameras at a Walmart in Codesah, Oklahoma. This tiny town only has a few thousand residents, so Huey and Palamao might have thought that they were going to be safe there. Instead, they were spotted at Walmart, and footage shows them smiling as they exited the store. What Huey and Palamao didn't know was that the police were already waiting for them. Once they heard the sound of sirens, they tried to make a getaway, but their great escape had undeniably come to an end. In his mad dash to escape, Huey crashed his car on the freeway and the engine burst into flames. With no options left, his deranged state of mind took over. Huey shot Palamao in the head before turning the gun on himself. Eventually, all that the police were left with were two corpses and a car that was burned to a crisp. This is one of those tragic stories where everyone dies, including the perpetrator. There's no lesson here, no moral, only the bleak reality of how easily manipulated human beings are and how terrifyingly violent they can become at the drop of a hat. The death of innocent children could have been avoided, but a combination of Huey's violent streak and Palamo's manipulation sealed their fate. Story 6: Less than we were after it happened. It's very disheartening. Cavallari, he was about killing people. I mean, he described the thrill he got killing people in this photo of what seemed like a simple but happy house. The Dardine family's home in Anna, Illinois became the scene of a brutal tragedy. In 1987, a pregnant woman was savagely beaten to death so violently that she went into labor during the attack, but she wasn't the only one. The entire family, including the young child in that photo, suffered the same horrific fate. This is without a doubt one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered on this channel, and trust me, anyone who's looked into this case would say the same thing. Stick with us and you'll soon see exactly why it's so haunting to really understand the Dardine family and the events that would follow. Let's rewind to 1986. That's when 29-year-old Russell Keith Darden and his wife Ruby Elaine Dardine moved to the tiny town of Anna, Illinois with their 2-year-old son Peter. By the way, they both preferred to go by their middle names Keith and Elaine now. The Dardines had settled into a beige and white mobile home on a piece of land right by Route 37. The Illinois Central Railroad tracks were just across the highway. Elaine, who was pregnant with their second child, a daughter they planned to name Casey, had a lot going on. Keith worked as a treatment plant operator while Elaine worked at an office supply store. They were a tight-knit family, super active in their local Baptist church, and even played in the musical ensemble. Despite their modest lifestyle, the couple was deeply committed to their son Peter's future, and a significant portion of their money went into his college fund. Even though he was only 2 at the time, Keith was so dedicated to his family that he even bought Kroger soda cans and resold them for 50 cents each. From this point of view, you could really tell that Keith was a family man, and all their neighbors would vouch for that. According to them, Keith and Elaine were always involved in the community, and everything seemed to be going well for the young family. It looked like life was on track for them to live happily ever after in their quiet corner of Illinois. But things in the neighborhood weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Around this time, there had been a disturbing rise in crime in Jefferson County, which had a population of about 38,577 in just the last 2 years. There had been a shocking 15 murders, including the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl in May of 1987. And it wasn't just the recent crimes that were concerning Anna. The town where the Dardines lived had its own dark history. There was a chilling case in 1924 where 2 people were murdered by their spouses through arsenic poisoning. Then in 1985, a man murdered his entire family while high on LSD. With all of this happening in and around the area, Keith couldn't ignore the rising tension. He felt uneasy about raising his family in a place that was becoming more dangerous by the day, especially with a new baby on the way. At one point, Keith told his mother that he and Elaine were planning to move back to Mount Carmel, Illinois, where he had grown up. He didn't give a specific reason, but it was clear that he was worried about the future. He even said it didn't matter whether he found a job there or not, he was determined to move back. I said, "Why are you coming back?" He said, "There's just too many things happening down here. There's people being murdered and robbed and just all kinds of meanness." And he said, "I don't like it." After Keith mentioned that to his mom, she thought it was a little strange, especially considering how focused the family had been on saving money. A move like that would be expensive, and it didn't really line up with the couple's usual careful planning. But Keith was determined. In fact, he even put their mobile home up for sale that same year. His desire to protect his family had only grown stronger, and it showed in his actions. One example that stood out was when he turned away a woman who came knocking on their door asking to use the phone. His protective instincts were clearly on high alert, but it left you wondering what was making him so uneasy. Well, the answer lies on November 18, 1987, when it's been several days since Keith failed to show up for work. As we've mentioned, Keith had always been reliable and did everything he could to save and earn money. So when he didn't show up for work that day, his boss immediately became concerned. He tried calling the house, but no one picked up. That's when he decided to reach out to Keith's parents, but they hadn't heard anything from the family either. At this point, everyone was on edge, so they decided it was time to call the police. The officers arrived at the mobile home and knocked on the door, but once again there was no answer. One officer peered through the window and saw people lying still on the bed under the blankets, but they weren't moving. Things were starting to feel off. So the police tried to open the door with a simple twist of the knob. They were about to uncover one of the most horrifying scenes. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. When the officers opened the door, they discovered the lifeless bodies of Elaine, her son Peter, and a tiny infant, all lying beneath blankets. Both Elaine and Peter were both bound and gagged with duct tape, their bodies beaten so brutally that Elaine had gone into labor and given birth to a baby girl during the attack. Even more heartbreaking is that their skulls were crushed because of the savage blows they've received, but the horror didn't stop there. The killer or killers showed no mercy. They went as far as to beat the newborn to death with a baseball bat. Interestingly, the bat was owned by the family, and it was a gift that Keith had given Peter earlier that year. When the police witnessed the scene, they were left in complete shock. Many officers who had witnessed their fair share of horrific crime scenes were visibly shaken by the brutality of what they saw. One of the most puzzling aspects was the lack of forced entry into the home, which ruled out the theory of a random robbery gone wrong. There were valuable items inside, things that could have easily been taken, but nothing was disturbed. Everything was still in its place. Even more perplexing was the fact that Elaine hadn't been sexually assaulted, which made the motive even harder to pinpoint. The killer had even attempted to clean up the blood, but it was determined that they had given up halfway through. This detail suggested the killer had time on their hands. Showing no signs of urgency, they weren't worried about being interrupted or caught, so whoever did this had all the time in the world to carry out their horrific plan. But what about Keith, the father? When the police arrived, he was nowhere to be found in the trailer, and the family's car was missing too. It didn't take long for the police to start suspecting that Keith might have killed his family and fled the scene. However, when the neighbors first heard about the possibility of Keith being responsible for the murders, it didn't sit right with them. It rattled me. I'll be the first to admit it rattled me completely, but I said there's no way I could even give any credibility to that thought whatsoever, because I knew he couldn't have done that. He just could not have ever done something like that. A search team of law enforcement officers was quickly assigned to look for him, but just as quickly as the search had been launched, it was called off. Keith's body was discovered by a group of hunters in a wheat field not far from the family's home. The following day, he had been shot 3 times in the head, a clear sign of an execution-style assassination. But the most shocking detail of all was that his genital appendage had been removed. Some accounts even suggested that the killer had stuffed it into Keith's mouth. This twisted act is a chilling indication that the killer was no ordinary criminal, but rather someone with the mind of a twisted psychopath capable of unimaginable brutality. It's also easy to guess that the killer had some experience, or maybe they had a serious personal vendetta against the family. As the investigation unfolded, officers pieced together that Keith was most likely killed in the family car, meaning the killer or killers must have driven him there. The blood found inside the vehicle ruled out the idea that Keith was murdered in the house. It was also determined that all the victims were killed within an hour of each other. Once the news spread, the town was on edge. They'd already been dealing with rising crime, but this case took things to a whole new level of unease. The family was well liked, had no known enemies, and suddenly there were no suspects. This left everyone wondering who could do something this brutal to a seemingly perfect family. Remember, there was no forced entry into the home, and the doors were left unlocked, so a robbery didn't seem to be the motive. Keith's gruesome sexual mutilation added more confusion, especially since there was no sign of sexual assault on Elaine. Additionally, no evidence was found to suggest any extramarital affairs, financial troubles, or any apparent grudges against the Dardine family. While there was a trace of marijuana found in the house, there was no solid proof that they were involved in drug dealing or even used drugs, so investigators assumed it likely belonged to the killer. That's when Keith's mother, Joan, floated a theory. Maybe someone had tried to pressure Keith into selling drugs, or maybe Elaine had turned down someone's advances and the killer lashed out in retaliation. This idea led the police to explore different possibilities, even considering the bizarre suggestion that a satanic cult might have been behind the murders, trying to appease the devil. However, experts in cults and ritual killings quickly dismissed this theory, saying There were no signs of cult activity with little to go on and no clear suspects. The police were left to focus on a theory: the killer must have somehow gained entry into the Dardine home, taken Keith out and murdered him somewhere else. Afterward they returned to the house, tied up Peter and Elaine and killed them both along with Elaine's newborn baby girl. But despite this theory, the investigation seemed to hit a dead end. No one seemed to have a real lead and the case was slipping further and further into the cold file pile. Additionally, it seemed like everyone had given up on solving this gruesome crime, but Keith's mother, Joanne, wasn't ready to let the case fade into obscurity. She wasn't going to let the brutality of what happened to her family be forgotten. She took matters into her own hands, gathering over 3,000 signatures in an effort to get the Oprah Winfrey Show to cover the case. Unfortunately, her request was denied because the producers claimed that the crime was just too brutal for daytime television. But Joan didn't give up. Her next move was to try to get the case featured on America's Most Wanted. At first the producers reacted the same way as Oprah's team, but after some persuasion they agreed to do a segment on the murders. In 1998 the show aired the segment. However, despite the high-profile attention, it didn't lead to any new leads or breakthroughs. The police were no closer to solving the murders than they had been back in 1987. Then, after 12 years of nothing, the police finally got a break. They received a lead on a possible suspect named Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a well-known serial killer linked to over 22 murders across the United States. Though he claimed to have killed over 70 people, his past was filled with trauma and darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere. Born into a tragic childhood, Tommy and his twin sister both contracted spinal meningitis when they were just 18 months old. While Tommy survived, his sister tragically passed away. Growing up, Tommy was without much guidance and didn't have anyone to turn to. His early years were marked by neglect and trauma. He began abusing substances at the young age of 7, a sign of the pain he was trying to escape. When Tommy was still a young boy, a man from a nearby town befriended him. On the surface, this man appeared to be someone who genuinely wanted to help a boy without any support. He would give Tommy gifts, take him out, and let him stay at his house. It wasn't until later that the disturbing truth came to light. The man was eventually convicted of child molestation, with Tommy being one of his victims. From the age of 8, Tommy had been abused by this man, a trauma that would go on to shape the twisted path of his life. By the age of 10, Tommy Lynn Sells had dropped out of school entirely, spending most days experimenting with smoking and drinking. At 13, after a troubling incident with his grandmother, Sells' mother, upset and alarmed, decided to leave with his siblings, leaving Tommy to fend for himself. From that point on, Sells had no family or stable home. He began drifting from town to town, finding ways to survive by doing odd jobs and taking what he needed to get by. Unfortunately, he started showing violent tendencies, with one early incident where he attacked a young woman, leaving her badly shaken. Sells later claimed that his first murder happened when he was just 16. He said he broke into a house and attacked a man who he alleged was harming a young boy, though no evidence was ever found to back up this story. Later, Sells also claimed he killed a man named John Cade Sr. in July of 1979. After Cade reportedly caught him breaking into his home. After that, Sells led a life constantly on the move, jumping from town to town, sneaking rides on trains and stealing to get by. Then in the year 2000, Sells was arrested in Del Rio, Texas after a horrifying attack on two young girls, 13-year-old Con Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Sadly, Con didn't survive, but Crystal lived through the ordeal and provided a description that finally led to Sells' capture. And while he was being held, Sells confessed to killing the Dardine family too, but his account was sketchy at best, and he kept changing his story in 2 different versions. He claimed to have met Keith Dardine first at a truck stop and then at a pool hall. In both stories, Sells said Keith invited him over for dinner. He said what started as A casual visit soon turned into something darker when Keith allegedly made a sexual proposition to Sells. According to Sells, Keith's offer sparked his rage and he decided to take it out on Keith. Sells forced Keith to drive him to a secluded area where he killed and mutilated him, then returned to the trailer to kill the other witnesses, Elaine and young Peter. Out of rage that he said had no stop button. In another version of events, Sells didn't mention the sexual proposition at all. Instead, he claimed he simply saw the for sale sign on the Dardene's trailer and saw an opportunity for violence. After drinking some beers and waiting for the right moment, he knocked on the door and pretended to be interested in buying the trailer. When Keith opened the door, Sells overpowered him, bound and gagged his family with duct tape and forced Keith to drive to a field. There he brutally castrated Keith before shooting him. He then returned to the trailer, raped Elaine and killed Peter and the newborn before cleaning up the scene and driving Keith's car to Benton. As you can see, many of his statements didn't line up with official records, and despite his confession, investigators couldn't find a shred of physical evidence tying him to the Dardene family's murder. But Sells tried to explain away these doubts by saying, "They say there's no physical evidence tying me to Dardenes, but there wasn't for any of them because they wasn't looking for me. I moved. I was always a transient, so to see if he was actually telling the truth." The investigators of Illinois wanted to bring Sells to their state to see if he could help them find critical evidence or show that he knew specific details about the crime scene. They hoped this would prove whether he was telling the truth or just making things up, but there was a catch. Texas law prohibits death row inmates from being moved to another state. Illinois officials tried to get an exception, hoping to bring Sells in for further questioning, but their request was denied without any concrete evidence linking Sells to the Dardene murders. Illinois authorities ultimately decided not to pursue charges. Now the doubts surrounding Sells' confession didn't only come from law enforcement, friends and family of Keith Dardene, the man Sells claimed to have met before the murders, also raised concerns about his story. They found it hard to believe that Keith, fully aware of the dangerous situation in the area due to years of violent killings, would invite a stranger into his home for dinner. A friend of Keith's remarked if he wouldn't let a young girl in to use the phone, he wouldn't let a 22-year-old man in. Sells claimed that Keith made a homosexual advance toward him also seemed suspicious. This didn't line up with what anyone knew about Keith's character. He had never shown any interest in men, and the police investigation didn't find any evidence to support Sells' claim. Detectives who spoke with Sells suspected that he fabricated this detail to make the crime seem more justified in his mind. Sells often used similar tactics when confessing to other murders, claiming that the victims had provoked him in some way, making it easier for him to justify his actions. As investigators dug deeper into Sells' confessions, it became increasingly clear that his story wasn't adding up. His details were often inconsistent, and as time passed, it became harder to believe he was truly responsible for the Dardene murders. It seemed like Sells was trying to take credit for these killings along with many others just to manipulate the legal system and make himself seem more dangerous or important in the end. Even though Sells confessed to more than 70 murders and was linked to over 22, he was only convicted of one, the murder of Con Harris. On April 4, 2014, he was executed by lethal injection for that crime, with no conviction tied to the Dardene murders. So despite everything, the Dardene family murders remain officially unsolved. The lack of solid evidence linking Sells to the crime leaves plenty of room for doubt, and many questions about what really happened that night are still up in the air. One of the biggest mysteries is the brutal nature of the murders, the violence used on the Dardene family, especially Elaine and her children, seemed excessively cruel even for someone like Sells. Some investigators have wondered if the killer might have had a personal connection to the family, but no evidence has ever surfaced to back that up. Another question that remains unanswered is the timeline of the murders. Did Keith come home to find the killer already there, or was he taken hostage during the attack? The fact that there was no forced entry suggests that the family might have known their killer, but without any solid leads. This is still just a theory. If you want us to dive deeper into Tommy Lionel's case, definitely let us know in the comments, but in the meantime we want to hear what you think about the Darty murders as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at MR Night Cared True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.